The papers slipped from her hands before she could stop them. They scattered across the polished bank floor, some sliding further as people walked past without noticing. By the time she bent down to gather them, the line behind her had already started slowing. A security guard stepped forward, his voice cutting through the quiet movement of the room. "Ma'am, you need to step aside." She didn't argue. She stayed crouched, carefully picking up each sheet as if they mattered more than the people waiting behind her. Her fingers moved slower than they should have. Not because she didn't understand what was happening, but because she was trying not to make it worse. Around her, the atmosphere began to shift. People weren't just waiting anymore. They were watching. Some with impatience, some with quiet judgment. No one offered to help. By the time she reached for the last paper, the guard spoke again, this time firmer. "Ma'am, you're holding up the line. If you're not ready, you'll have to leave." That was the moment she paused, not out of shock, but as if she had expected it. She held the paper in her hand for a second, then slowly stood up, using the counter for support. Her eyes moved briefly across the room before settling back in front of her. "I just needed help with the form," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it now, something that hadn't been there before. The guard didn't respond to that. He simply gestured toward the side. The message was clear. Step away or step out. For a moment, it looked like she would do exactly that. Walk away quietly, like none of this mattered. But instead, she adjusted the papers in her hand, straightened them carefully, and placed one of them on the counter. "Before I go," she said, "could you check one thing for me?" The guard barely looked at it. "What is it?" She tapped lightly on the paper, just one line. "Tell me the name on this account." The guard glanced at it the way people glance at things they have no intention of reading. His eyes moved across the page without focus. Then he looked back at her. "You'll need to speak with a teller for that. This isn't something I handle." She nodded once, as though she had been told exactly what she expected to be told. She gathered the papers back into a careful stack, folded them along a crease that already existed, as if they had been folded that way many times before, and placed them into a worn fabric bag she carried on her left arm. She moved toward the teller windows without being directed. She already knew where they were. The guard watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to his position near the door. The line resumed. The room settled. And for most of the people in that lobby, the moment was already over. She was simply the slow old woman who had dropped her papers. Nothing more. Nothing worth a second thought. But the paper she had placed on the counter, the one with the single line she had asked him to read, he hadn't actually read it. He had looked at it. That was not the same thing. And somewhere in the way she walked toward the teller window, steady, unhurried, without looking back, there was something that didn't quite fit the picture everyone had already formed of her. Something that hadn't announced itself. Something that simply existed, quiet and patient. The way certain things do when they have no need to prove themselves to anyone. She reached the teller window and set her bag down on the small ledge in front of the glass. She waited. The teller, a young woman with her hair pulled back and the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of transactions that week, finished typing something on her screen before looking up. "How can I help you?" Her tone was neutral, professional, the kind of neutral that could become warm if the situation called for it, or remain exactly as it was if it didn't. She looked at the woman on the other side of the glass and made, in less than a second, the kind of assessment that most people make and never acknowledge making. "I need help with a form," the old woman said, "and I need to access an account. Do you have your identification?" "I do." She opened the fabric bag and began looking through it. The teller waited. A few seconds passed, then a few more. The woman behind the old woman in line shifted her weight to the other foot. Someone further back exhaled, not loudly, but just enough to be heard by the people nearest to them. The old woman found what she was looking for and slid a card in a folded document under the glass. The teller picked up the identification card first, glanced at it, then began typing. "And the account number?" "It's on the document." The teller unfolded it, scanned it briefly. "This is an older format," she said. "We may need to look this up manually." "That's fine." The teller typed for a moment, then stopped. She typed again, using a slightly different sequence. She frowned, Not dramatically, just the small, contained expression of someone whose system isn't cooperating the way she expected. "Can I ask when this account was last accessed?" The old woman considered the question for a moment. "It's been some time," she said. "How long?" "Several years." The teller nodded slowly, still looking at the screen. "I'm going to need to go through a verification process for an account that hasn't been active recently. It's standard procedure." "Of course," the woman said. "It might take a few minutes." "I'm not in a hurry." The teller glanced at her briefly. Something about the way the woman had said that, not dismissively, not sarcastically, just as a simple statement of fact, registered somewhere. But the moment passed quickly, the way most small moments do when there is a line of people waiting and a screen full of tasks to complete. She began the verification process. The old woman stood at the window and waited. Behind her, the line had grown by 2 more people. One of them, a man in a gray jacket, looked at his phone, then at the woman at the window, then at his phone again. The movement at this particular window had slowed to almost nothing, and the contrast with the other windows, where transactions were moving forward with the brisk rhythm of routine, was becoming more visible. People notice when something is taking longer than it should. They don't always say anything, but they notice. And in that noticing, a kind of pressure builds, wordless, directionless, but felt by everyone within range of it, including the person at the center of it. She felt it too. She didn't show it. She stood with her hands resting on her bag, her posture neither stiff nor slouched, her eyes forward. Not vacant, present. There was a difference, though from a distance it might have been difficult to name what that difference was. The teller typed something, waited, typed again. "I'm not seeing a match in the current system," she said after a moment. "The account number is showing as dormant." "That would be correct," the woman said. The teller looked up. "You knew it was dormant?" "Yes." "Then what is it you're trying to do today, exactly?" The question wasn't rude, but it carried the faint implication that whatever the answer was, it was going to require more time and effort than the window was designed to handle. "I'd like to have it reviewed," the old woman said, "and I have some papers I need to submit." "What kind of papers?" "They relate to the account, and to an arrangement that was made through this branch." The teller looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I'm going to need to involve a supervisor for something like that," she said. "This goes beyond standard teller services." "I understand." "You're welcome to have a seat while I make that call. It might be a bit of a wait." She gestured toward a row of chairs along the side wall, the kind of chairs that exist in every bank lobby, functional and forgettable, placed precisely at the edge of where the main activity happens, close enough to feel included, far enough to feel moved aside. The old woman looked at the chairs, then she looked back at the teller. "Before I sit down," she said, "could you look at the account and tell me the name it's registered to?" The teller seemed mildly puzzled by the request. "You don't know the name on your own account?" "I know it," the woman said. "I want you to look at it." There was a pause. The teller turned back to her screen, found the dormant account record, and looked at the name field. She read it once, then she read it again. Something in her expression shifted, imperceptibly, the way a light changes when a cloud passes across the sun. Not dark, not bright, just different. But she didn't say anything. She simply looked up at the woman across the glass, and for just a moment, one moment, brief and unrepeatable, she saw her slightly differently than she had before. She couldn't have said why. Not yet. "I'll call the supervisor," she said. Her voice was the same, professionally neutral, but something underneath it had changed by approximately 1 degree. "Thank you," the woman said, and she went to sit in the chairs along the wall. She settled into the seat nearest the end and set her bag on the adjacent chair, not to take up space, but because setting it on the floor required bending down again, and she had already done that once today. The lobby continued around her. Transactions were completed, people came and went, the line moved. Numbers were called from a digital display above the service desk. She watched none of it with urgency and all of it with attention. This was a habit she had carried for a long time, the ability to sit inside a busy room and observe without leaning into any of it, without needing to be part of the forward motion, without measuring the passing of time against any particular deadline. Most people, when they are made to wait, fight the waiting. They check their phones, they shift in their seats, they calculate how much longer it might take, then recalculate, then grow quietly resentful of the calculation itself. She did none of that. She sat with her hands in her lap and she looked at the bank. Not at the people, at the bank itself. The high ceiling with its modern recessed lighting, functional and clean, the kind of lighting designed to communicate trustworthiness without warmth. The floor, polished to a finish that reflected the movement above it. The partitions between workstations, low and practical, meant to give the impression of openness while still maintaining the careful geography of who was allowed where. She had known this building when it was different. Not different in the way that buildings are different when you haven't seen them in a while and noticed the small changes. A new paint color, rearranged furniture, an updated logo on the wall. Different in a deeper way. She had known it before the renovation, before the current signage, before the polished floors and the recessed lighting and the low partitions. She had known it when it was still uncertain whether any of this would survive. She didn't think about that now in a way that produced emotion. It was more like a fact that lived inside the room with her, the way the weight of a building lives in its foundation. Invisible, structural, essential, and completely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't been there when it was laid. The chairs she was sitting in were positioned against a wall that had once held a set of wooden doors, internal doors that led to a corridor of private offices. She knew this because she had walked through those doors more than once, because she had sat in one of those offices across a desk from a man who was very afraid, and she had listened to him explain why the bank was going to fail, and then she had decided it wouldn't. She let that memory sit for a moment, then she set it aside. The lobby continued. A child near the entrance dropped a toy and retrieved it. Two employees crossed the floor in conversation, heading toward the service desk. She watched a young man at one of the teller windows sign something without reading it. She noticed small things the way she always had, not because they were important, but because noticing was simply what her attention did when it was given space to move. After some time, the teller who had taken her documents appeared from behind the partition and walked toward a door marked Staff Only. She was gone for perhaps 3 minutes. When she returned, she came back to the service desk and said something to a colleague who glanced briefly toward the waiting chairs. The colleague looked at the old woman, then looked away, then looked once more. None of this was dramatic. It was barely noticeable. The kind of exchange that happens 100 times a day in a place like this, when someone passes along a task or a problem or a small piece of information that requires another set of eyes. But the old woman had noticed it, and she had understood the way she understood most things, quietly, without needing it confirmed. Something had shifted, just slightly. It hadn't announced itself. It rarely did. She straightened the documents in her bag, folded her hands back in her lap, and continued to wait. She was still waiting, still seated at the end of the row of chairs when the door at the far end of the lobby opened and a man walked through it with the particular kind of purpose that belongs to people who manage things. He was not rushing, but he was moving. He was perhaps 50, with the groomed and calibrated appearance of someone whose role required him to be the first person a difficult situation encountered. He wore his authority comfortably, without excess. His jacket was fitted. His expression was arranged into something cooperative but measured. The face of a man who had been told there was a customer requiring attention and who had come out ready to apply the correct amount of patience before arriving at a resolution. He crossed the lobby at a pace that suggested efficiency rather than urgency. He stopped in front of her. Mrs. He checked the card he was carrying, then looked up. Mrs. Elara Voss? She looked up at him without hurry. Yes? I'm the branch manager, he said, extending his hand. My name is Daniel Howell. I understand you're here about an older account. That's correct. He gestured toward the seating area, the same area she was already in, as though offering it to her, then seemed to register that she was already seated and adjusted smoothly. If you'd like, we can talk through what you need and I'll see what we can do for you. His tone was pleasant, professionally pleasant, the kind of pleasantness that comes with mild impatience underneath it. He sat down in the chair beside hers, not across from her, which was a deliberate choice, a technique that communicated informality, accessibility. We're on the same level. This won't take long. Let's sort this out together. She noted the technique. She had used it herself, once or twice, in rooms very different from this one. The account is under my name, she said. It was established through this branch. There's also a set of documents I need to submit. They relate to a private arrangement that was made at the time the account was opened. He nodded, making a small note on a pad he had brought with him. And the account has been dormant for some years, I understand. It has. That's not unusual, he said, with the brief reassurance of someone moving past a potential complication. We can look into reactivating it, provided verification is in order. Did the teller take your identification? She did? Good. He wrote something. And the arrangement you mentioned, can you tell me a bit more about the nature of it? Was it a trust? A structured investment product? It was a direct private investment, she said, made during a period when the bank needed liquidity. Something shifted in the air between them, the kind of shift that doesn't have a sound. He looked up from his pad. The way she had said it, direct private investment during a period when the bank needed liquidity, was not the language of someone who had been sold a product. It was the language of someone who had been at a table. I see, he said, but the two words came out slightly differently than the two words he had been saying for the previous several minutes. They were the same words, same tone almost, but they landed at a different depth. He clicked his pen once. Let me pull up the full account record, he said. I'll need to do that on a proper terminal. If you'd like to come through to one of our meeting rooms, we'll have more privacy. That's fine, she said. He stood. She began to gather her bag. He waited for her without checking his watch. That was new. She noticed it the way she noticed most things. Without comment, without acknowledgement, simply filing it in the part of her attention that kept an accurate record of how people behaved and when that behavior changed and what the change meant. They walked across the lobby toward a door she remembered being in a different location. The renovation had moved things, but the weight of the building was the same. The meeting room was small and clean. A table, 4 chairs, a screen on the wall, a credenza against one side. The kind of room where nothing is decorative. Everything serves a function, and the function is to conduct business without distraction. He sat across from her this time, at the terminal built into the side table. She placed her bag on the table in front of her and removed the documents, setting them in a neat stack without being asked. He typed in the account number from the card the teller had sent through. The system loaded. He read what came up on the screen, then he read it again. His face did not change exactly, but the pace of his reading slowed. The way reading slows when the eyes have found something that the mind needs a moment to process. He typed a secondary search, her name, directly. More records came up. He scrolled. The scrolling took longer than it should have for a simple account query. She watched him without expression. He scrolled further. He stopped at something, read it, moved back up, read something else, then came back down to the first entry again. The room was quiet enough that the soft hum of the terminal's ventilation was audible. He sat back slightly in his chair. Not dramatically, just the almost imperceptible shift of someone who has just absorbed a piece of information that has rearranged the furniture in the room they thought they were sitting in. Mrs. Voss, he said. Yes, he looked at her. Not the professional look from earlier, the practiced, measured, efficient look of a branch manager handling a customer matter. This was something different, something that hadn't been arranged in advance. This account, he said. The primary account. It's listed under a founding investor classification. Yes, she said. That classification, he paused. That's not a classification we use in current operations. It's from the original institutional structure, from before the branch was reorganized. Before the 2009 reorganization, she said, without hesitation. He looked at her. You're familiar with it. I was present for it. He didn't respond immediately. He turned back to the screen and moved to a different section of the record, a section that was not standard account information, the kind of section that requires a higher level of access to view, the kind that doesn't come up in routine queries, the kind that most people who work in a branch go their entire career without ever opening. He found what he was looking for. He read it. And this time, when he looked up at her, the professional composure was still there. It was too ingrained to disappear, but there was something else present alongside it, something closer to stillness than to surprise. "The documents from 2008, he said. "Yes. You were one of 3 private investors who intervened directly." "I was. The amount listed here—" "I know the amount," she said. He stopped. He looked at the papers she had placed on the table, the stack of documents she had been carrying in that worn fabric bag, the papers that had scattered across the polished lobby floor an hour ago while people walked past without noticing. He looked at them differently now. Not because they were different, because he was. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're here for today, because what I'm looking at suggests that this branch, this institution, has a very significant obligation attached to your account. One that should have been, it should have required ongoing management." "It was managed," she said, "for a time, and then it wasn't." "And you didn't pursue it?" "No." "May I ask why?" She considered the question for a moment. "Because I didn't need to," she said simply. She reached across the table and placed her hand on the stack of documents. "These are the original agreements," she said, "and a letter. I'd like you to read the letter before we discuss the rest." He looked at the documents. Then he reached across and took the one she indicated. A single page, folded in thirds, the crease lines soft with age, and he unfolded it. He read it in silence. The room held very still. When he finished, he set it down. He did not say anything for a moment. The ventilation hummed. Outside the glass partition, the lobby continued its ordinary operations. The digital number display advanced. A teller window closed for a short break. Someone laughed briefly at the service desk. "This is addressed to the branch," he said. "Yes. It's dated 2009. "The week the reorganization was finalized," she said. "I wrote it then. I wasn't going to send it at the time. But I kept it. And now you're submitting it." "Now I'm submitting it," she said. He looked at the letter again without picking it up. The letter was not threatening. It did not demand anything. It did not catalog grievances or outline legal positions. It was, in its way, one of the quietest documents he had ever read. It spoke only about what the branch had been before the collapse threatened it, about what had been worth preserving, about the belief, held at the time, that some institutions are worth saving not because of what they contain, but because of what they represent to the people who have built their lives around them. It ended with a single sentence that he read twice. He didn't quote it aloud. He didn't need to. She had written it. She already knew what it said. "I need to escalate this," he said. "This goes well above branch level. There are people at the regional office, and above that, who need to be aware that you've come in today." "I know," she said. "I also need to apologize," he said. She looked at him. "For today. For the way you were treated when you arrived." She held his gaze for a moment. "You weren't here for that part," she said. "No," he said, "but it happened in this branch, and I'm responsible for this branch." She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the documents on the table, the stack she had organized in her kitchen that morning, that she had placed into the fabric bag alongside her identification, that she had carried in through the front door of this bank, and promptly scattered across its floor while people watched, and no one moved to help her. "I've been treated worse," she said. It wasn't an absolution. It wasn't a dismissal of what had happened. It was simply a fact, stated without weight, offered in the same quiet register as everything else she had said that day. He nodded. He didn't try to say anything further about it. He picked up his phone and made a call. While he made the call, she sat back in her chair and looked at the wall. Not at anything particular on the wall. Through it, perhaps, at something only she could see. She thought about 2008. She thought about the phone call she had received late in the evening from a man she barely knew who told her that the bank was going to close before the end of the week unless something changed. She had listened to him. She had asked 4 questions. He had answered them as honestly as someone in that position could answer anything. She had said she would call him back in the morning. She had spent that night going through numbers that most people would not have understood how to read. Not because she was extraordinary, but because she had spent 40 years learning exactly how to read them. Because she had come up in a time when people who looked like her were not supposed to be in rooms where those numbers were discussed, which meant she had to understand those numbers better than everyone else in the room, every single time, without exception and without acknowledgement. She had called back in the morning. She had said yes, not out of sentiment. She wasn't a sentimental investor and had no interest in becoming one. She had said yes because the numbers made sense, because the underlying value was real, because the threat was temporary and the institution was not. She had been right. She had known she was right at the time. She had not needed anyone to confirm it then. She did not need it confirmed now. The manager finished his call and set the phone down. "Someone from regional is going to be here within the hour," he said, "and I've asked our senior client services officer to join us. Is there anything I can get for you in the meantime?" "Water would be fine," she said. "Of course." He stood, paused. "Is there anything else? Anything you need from us today, specifically? Beyond the documents?" She thought about the question. Not the account, not the legal arrangement, not the numbers, the letter. She had carried it for 15 years, not because she needed to, not because it served any financial purpose, because it said something she had wanted to say to this place when she left it, and she had never been sure whether the saying of it mattered to anyone but herself. Now she had said it. That was what she had come for. "No," she said. "That covers it." He left to get the water. She sat alone in the small, clean room and looked again at the letter resting on the table. Unfolded now, its creases flattened by age and by use, its handwriting slightly faded but still entirely legible. She had written it by hand. She always wrote important things by hand. The manager was gone for less than 3 minutes. When he returned with the water, she was sitting exactly as he had left her, composed, unhurried, looking at nothing in particular with the focused attention of someone who is thinking carefully. But something else had happened while he was gone. The teller from window 3, the young woman who had processed her identification, who had searched the dormant account, who had read the name on the screen and said nothing but looked at her differently for one unrepeatable moment, had walked past the meeting room on her way to the break area. She had glanced through the glass partition as she passed. She saw the old woman sitting at the table. She saw the stack of documents. She saw the manager's jacket draped over his chair. She saw, or perhaps only sensed, the way people sometimes sense things they cannot yet fully articulate, that the situation in that room was not the situation she had originally assessed it to be. She kept walking, but she walked slightly more slowly than she had before. At the service desk, the security guard who had told her to step aside was in the middle of a brief exchange with a colleague near the entrance. He was describing something, a gesture, it seemed, and the colleague was nodding. The guard was recounting something. He stopped mid-sentence. He had seen what the teller had seen. Not much. Just the meeting room, the documents, the manager's posture visible through the glass, which was not the posture of a man managing a difficult customer. It was the posture of a man managing a situation. The guard said something else, something quieter, and his colleague turned to look across the lobby. Neither of them said anything further. The lobby continued. But it continued differently, the way a room continues after the temperature in it has changed. All the same activity, all the same sound, but with something altered in the atmosphere that no one can quite point to. The awareness moved through the branch the way awareness always moves through enclosed spaces. Not announced, not explained, just felt, quietly, by the people who were paying attention. Some of them were. Most of them weren't. But the ones who were, the guard, the teller, the colleague at the service desk who had glanced at the waiting chairs earlier in the afternoon, those people were now carrying a small and uncomfortable knowledge. Not of who she was. Not yet. But of the possibility that they had been wrong about her. That is a particular kind of discomfort, not the discomfort of being caught in something deliberate. None of them had been deliberately cruel. They had been ordinarily careless, in the way that most people are ordinarily careless with strangers who do not present any obvious reason to be otherwise. But ordinary carelessness, when placed beside extraordinary context, has a way of looking worse than it is and also exactly as bad as it is, both at the same time. The guard adjusted his position near the entrance. He straightened. Not because anyone had told him to, because something in the room had reminded him, without saying a word, that behavior is observable and that observation has memory. Back in the meeting room, the manager set the water down in front of her and took his seat again. She drank from it and set it beside the documents. "While we wait," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something, if that's all right." She looked at him, which he took as permission. "You mentioned that the account wasn't managed after a certain point, that you didn't pursue it." He paused. "Was there a reason you came in today, specifically, after so long?" She looked at him steadily. "Several reasons," she said. "You don't have to—" "One of them," she said, "was curiosity." He waited. "I wanted to see what this place had become," she said. "I was involved in preserving it. I never came back to see whether the preservation was worth anything." She looked at the documents on the table. "I think that's a reasonable thing to want to know," she said. "And is it?" he asked. "Worth something?" She considered the room, the clean walls, the functional furniture, the window that looked out at the lobby, ordinary and operational, full of the small practical business of people managing the logistics of their lives. "Ask me again when I've finished reading the numbers," she said. It was the closest thing to a smile that had crossed her face all day. He found that he had nothing to add to that. He folded his hands on the table and waited alongside her, in the quiet of the room, for the people who were coming. Outside, in the lobby, the afternoon continued, the line moved, the transactions completed, the numbers on the display advanced in their patient sequence, and at the chairs along the wall, the chairs where she had sat for the better part of an hour, the chairs positioned at the exact edge of where things happen and where things are merely witnessed, the one she had occupied was empty now. The bag was no longer there. No one had thought twice about her when she was sitting in those chairs. She had been, to most of the people in that room, invisible in the particular way that people become invisible when they are old and unhurried and carry nothing that signals importance. Now the chairs were empty, and she was in a private meeting room with the branch manager and documents that had been retrieved from the dormant archives of a financial crisis. And the lobby carried on. Ordinary, completely ordinary, except that it wasn't quite anymore. The regional officer arrived 40 minutes later. She was a woman in her mid-40s, composed and precise, who entered the meeting room carrying a leather portfolio and a controlled expression. She had clearly been briefed, not fully perhaps, but enough. She shook the old woman's hand before she sat down. She shook it with both of hers. That was not standard. The conversation that followed was conducted with the careful deliberateness of people navigating something significant without yet knowing all of its edges. There were questions about the original arrangement. There were references to records that had been scanned and sent ahead. There were careful acknowledgments made, the kind that do not admit fault outright but make it unmistakably clear that something has been handled incorrectly and that the handling has been insufficient for a very long time. Elora Voss answered every question with the same precision and calm she had brought to the teller window. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation. She did not recite the history of what she had done as though it were a credential that required constant display. She simply answered questions. She asked several of her own, specific ones, about current institutional structure, about the branch's recent performance, about certain commitments that had been made in the 2009 documentation and whether they had been honored. The regional officer answered as fully as she could. Some of what she said satisfied. Some of it did not. Elora noted both without comment. At one point, the manager, who had remained in the room throughout, slightly to the side, the way people position themselves when they understand they are present not as a primary party but as a witness, reached for his phone and quietly sent a message to the teller at window 3. He told her to hold any remaining customers. He did not explain why. He didn't need to. She had already, more or less, understood. By late afternoon, a senior administrator had been reached by phone. Arrangements were made to review the full scope of the account and the associated agreements. A follow-up meeting was scheduled for the following week, not at the branch, but at the regional office. There was a conversation about the letter. It was not a long conversation, but it was a real one. The kind of conversation that happens when people are forced, briefly, to set aside the language of process and liability and speak about something more directly. The regional officer said that the letter would be formally received into the institutional record. Alara said that was sufficient. Not what she had hoped for. Not more than she had expected. Sufficient. The meeting concluded without ceremony. The paperwork was organized and receipted. The officers thanked her. The manager stood when she stood, which was not something he would have done, she suspected, if she had left through the front door the same way she had arrived, as the slow old woman with the scattered papers. She picked up her bag. She tucked the documents inside, minus the letter, which was now formally submitted, and folded the flap. She walked toward the door of the meeting room. The manager opened it for her. She paused for a moment in the doorway, not because she had forgotten something, not because she needed to, but because she found, standing at the boundary between the private room and the public lobby, that she wanted to look at the bank one more time before she left it. She looked. The lobby was quieter now. The late afternoon light came through the upper windows at an angle that softened everything it touched. The line that had formed behind her that morning was long gone. Those people had completed their transactions and gone on with their days, unaware of what had occupied the rest of this afternoon. The teller at window 3 was still at her station. She was processing something, head down, focused. She looked up, as people sometimes do when they feel attention without knowing why, and met Alara's gaze across the lobby. A moment passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not reckoning exactly. Something quieter than both. The teller looked back at her screen. Alara looked toward the entrance. The security guard was near the door. She would have to walk past him to leave. She walked. She did not hurry. He saw her coming. And the thing that happened then was small enough that most people in the room would not have noticed it at all. He moved. Not out of her way. She had room enough to walk. But he stepped slightly to the side, and as she drew level with him, he gave a brief nod. The kind of nod that is not a greeting and not an apology and not a performance, just an acknowledgement. She received it without expression. She walked through the doors and out into the afternoon light. The city was at the particular hour when the pace of everything shifts almost imperceptibly. Slightly less urgent than midday, not yet quieted toward evening. People moved with the particular efficiency of people who have one more thing to do before the day is finished. She walked at her own pace, which had not changed, which was not slow, precisely, but which belonged to a different register than urgency. The register of someone who has learned, through the long accumulation of time, that the speed at which you move towards something rarely changes what you find when you arrive. She had moved at this pace for years, in boardrooms and in offices and in quiet rooms where large amounts of money changed hands without anyone raising their voice. She had moved at this pace when she said yes to the phone call at the end of an evening in 2008. She moved at it now, on a sidewalk in the late afternoon, carrying a fabric bag that contained a set of original financial documents and the empty folder where the letter had been. She did not look back at the bank. She had seen everything she came to see. The numbers would be reviewed. The arrangement would be formalized in the current framework. There would be meetings and documentation and the careful institutional language that surrounds the correction of a long oversight. All of that would happen, or most of it would. She had enough experience to know the difference between a process that has been set in motion and a promise that has been made, and she did not confuse the two. But the letter had been submitted. That was the part that mattered to her, in the way that things matter when they are not about money and not about power, but about something older and more personal. The desire to say, once, to a place that has taken something from you and received something from you and changed because of you, that you were here, that you knew what you were doing, that you did it with your eyes open, and that it was worth doing. She had said it, 15 years late, perhaps, but said. The afternoon light moved across the buildings ahead of her. A bus pulled to a stop half a block away. Someone held a door open for someone else. A small, unremarkable courtesy exchanged between strangers who would never see each other again. She kept walking. She thought briefly about the guard's nod. Not about what it meant in the large sense. She had no interest in the large sense of it. Only the small one, the specific, human, imperfect small one. He had not known who she was when she arrived. He had treated her accordingly. Then he had learned something. And the nod was what happened between the learning and the not knowing what to do with it. She understood that. She had been in that place herself, more times than she could count. The place where what you know has outrun what you feel, and the gap between the two produces a small, inadequate gesture that is still, in its inadequacy, real. She didn't forgive it. She didn't hold it. She simply noted it, the way she noted most things, and walked. A person who did not know her, who had not been in the bank that day, who had no context for the afternoon she had just spent, would have seen only an old woman walking at an unhurried pace through the ordinary light of an ordinary late afternoon, which is in the end exactly what she was, along with everything else. She reached the corner and stopped, waiting for the light to change. The city moved around her. She stood in it, patient and unremarkable, the way she had stood in the bank lobby that morning before the papers fell. The same woman, the same pace, the same quality of attention directed outward at a world that had no idea what it was standing next to. The light changed, she crossed, and the afternoon received her without ceremony, the way it receives everyone, without distinction, without acknowledgement, without the slightest awareness of what has just passed or what it cost or what it was worth. That too she had come to accept, not as a wound, as a fact, one of the many quiet facts that accumulate over a long life and settle, eventually, into something that is not quite peace and not quite resignation, but lives, if you let it, very comfortably between the two. She turned the corner, she was gone, and in the bank behind her, the lobby continued its ordinary operations. The line moved. The numbers advanced. The teller at window 3 processed the next transaction, and the one after that with the same efficiency she always brought to her work. But somewhere in the back of her attention, below the level of what she would have been able to articulate if asked, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would change the next transaction or the one after that, but in the way that certain experiences shift things that were not supposed to move, quietly, at the level of assumption, at the place where judgment lives before it knows it is judging. That was not nothing. It was in fact the only kind of change that lasts. The guard stood near the entrance. He was doing his job, the same as always, watching the door, noting who came in, monitoring the floor. But for the remainder of that shift, and for some time after, he would think about a piece of paper placed on a counter, and a request. Quiet, precise, carrying no anger. Tell me the name on this account. He had not read it. He had looked at it. He would think about that difference for longer than he expected, not because he was a particularly reflective person, but because that is what certain moments do. They stay past their welcome, past the point where they serve any obvious purpose, and they ask something of you that you cannot fully answer. He let the moment stay. The afternoon passed into evening. The branch closed at its usual time. Lights dimmed in the sequence they always dimmed, locks engaged. The lobby settled into the particular quiet of a closed building, still and dim and carrying within it, somewhere in the air or in the walls or in the particular density of silence that gathers in a space after people leave, the trace of everything that had passed through it that day. The papers on the counter, the woman at the window, the chairs along the wall, the meeting room with the documents and the water and the letter unfolded, the nod at the door. All of it, irretrievable now in the way that all moments are irretrievable once they become the past, present only in the people who carried them out of the building and into the rest of their lives, where they would do whatever moments do when they are finished being moments. Settle. Become part of the architecture of what a person knows. Become, slowly and without announcement, part of how they see.